Hi, folks. Welcome to Monday's edition of the iWrite Radio podcast stroke videocast. We'll mention the presser in passing, but I think there is one topic that's going to come out of that might take up most of the show in one way or another. Stuart, you were quite impressed with Stuart Cosgrove's piece in the National today.
Yeah, we'd like to talk. Well, that was the Sunday National. I think we should talk about that later on as well.
So we'll mention that. But I have a sneaky feeling that most of the program will be taken up with what will be, I think, the first subject, which is, at today's press conference, everybody, including the mainstream media, was pushing the question of whether Scotland would be going into full lockdown in order to benefit from the furlough scheme being extended for another month. Now, that isn't the way they put it, but I think that's the nub of the question.
There are a number of varieties of how to describe it. I like Douglas Fraser, I actually quite like Douglas Fraser, the BBC's long-term business correspondent. His headline is "Furlough's Further Furlong." I'm sorry, got my teeth stuck there. Furlough's Further Furlong. Every time I write it down, I wish I'd got a shorthand for it. Well, obviously, my own shorthand, I just put an F in a circle and I know what I'm talking about.
Well, what I found interesting about Douglas Fraser's piece was, this was on the BBC site, news site, and he actually put the question simply, is it fair? How come none of the devolved nations, who I think it's fair to argue would have gone into some more serious form of lockdown if they'd thought furlough had been available for them, couldn't get furlough until England decided to go into lockdown, and all of a sudden the money's available?
Well, it falls into the category of driving more people in Scotland and Wales, I would have thought now, because it's remarkable how the thought of independence has taken off in Wales, which it wasn't there before. But certainly in Scotland, they just, every week, they come up with another wheeze to drive people to vote yes.
I can't believe that Rishi Sunak will not agree. I think it will kind of depend on how much traction DRoss, Douglas Ross, the leader of the Tories in Scotland, how much his two pieces in the papers today, how much traction they get. He is now claiming that he has always been in favor of the deal being that the devolved nations could lock down when it suited them and get furlough money. I can't remember him mentioning this until it became a bone of contention over this English lockdown. And I don't know why Douglas Thompson doesn't simply decide to join the Liberal Democrats, because he's getting more and more liberal by the second.
He trailed this speech he's made at some policy union, I don't know. He trailed it over the weekend. Apparently this morning, while he was actually making this speech live on the internet, the fire alarm went off in the building where he was delivering it from, which is a little unfortunate. But it was actually a regular fire alarm. It's a fire alarm practice. Did you think somebody might have? I don't think anybody sabotaged him.
You live in hope. But he was interviewed on Good Morning Scotland today, and given a fairly hard time, I have to say. The thrust of the questioning was, will you spend your whole career simply U-turning and opposing decisions made by your boss at Westminster?
It says here, in a speech tomorrow, which is now today, Mr. Ross will say that the handling of the coronavirus pandemic has put devolution to the test and exposed its weakest points. The UK government must treat Scotland the same way as England.
That's the gist of it. Douglas Thompson would have no problem, Douglas Ross would have no problem whatsoever if Westminster was dictating to Scotland what to do and when to do it in regard to the pandemic. That wouldn't worry him.
That's what their style has been all through the spring, all of the Tories.
So his only worry is that this could benefit the SNP's drive for independence.
I think it's slightly more short term than that. I think they're simply looking at the Holyrood election next year for the first time. The Tories are now established as the opposition in Scotland, whereas it used to be Labour was the opposition.
Well, they've had one parliament as the opposition. I wouldn't say established, but I think I think everything indicates that he's in election mode.
They're trying to, they need to boost their percentage votes next May to make any dent at all into the progress towards independence.
Well, I fully expect, I mean, he's kicked off early in complete opposition to Westminster on school meals, the furlough scheme. And part of me can't help but feel this is some sort of Dominic Cummings Machiavellian ploy to make him look good, because he is going to claim that, having spoken to Mr. Gove, he has forced Westminster to change its tune, without realizing, of course, that'll backfire, because if Westminster has to be forced to be fair to the devolved nations, that means there's something wrong with the union.
Well, there'll be that, and also down south, they'll be seen to be dancing to the tune of Scotland, and you know how that works down south in the voting. Remember who was in whose pocket for that election?
Well, yeah, that's another one. I mean, the ramifications of it are huge. I also see a direct link to the internal market bill in this. The purse strings will always be a way to control what devolved governments do. If you don't give them the money, they can't build the roads. It's the simplest way to put it. But in a pandemic, if you don't give them the money, people die. It's pretty stark. You can turn around and say, without allowing the Scottish government to do what is best for Scotland, because you're refusing to finance them, you as an English government, which you are in terms of health, are killing people in Scotland. It can be put that starkly.
But bear in mind, there are people in that Tory regime in London that believe in eugenics.
Well, the point I'm making here is nobody has said that decisions made in England that will affect Scotland through the internal market bill could also be deadly. They could be deadly for our NHS, for our farmers, for our fishing industry. If England chooses to go in a different direction and they deem that direction will affect the internal market, Scotland could be forced to take the same route to its own detriment. And that is the problem with the internal market bill. And I think all this pandemic furlough nonsense does is highlight where we're going to be come February.
There is still the question which came up a couple of times at today's presser. Will Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, or Gove, or at the end of the day, is it probably Dominic Cummings pulling the strings down there? Will they say yes to a flexible furlough scheme? Let me get, who is it? Not that one. Douglas Fraser's quote. I'm told that governments in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland all asked for a return to full furlough support in order to let them put in place tight restrictions they deemed necessary to suppress viral infection. Downing Street said no, as there isn't enough money. But now that England requires lockdown, there is enough money, borrowed money. That's clearly going to rankle and doesn't sound like a partnership of equals. But the question is, will they say yes? Will they say yes or no? If they say yes to be flexible, how does that go down in England? How does it look in England?
Well, that's the political problem.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like the union has already been sundered.
So and how does it look in Manchester?
Again, well, arguably they're in charge of Manchester.
Well, what if it makes Scotland look as though it's handling the pandemic much better than London?
That's the other one. Well, here's what I think will happen. I think Sunak will agree to be flexible, but the timescales will be dictated by London. So if they're extending it for a month for England to cover this lockdown, they will be prepared to give a month's worth of money to Wales, Ireland, and Scotland.
Yes, but
it won't be done on the time necessary. It will be done on the time necessary in England.
Right. Well, they're already stuck on their own problem, which is there's no guarantee that this 4-week lockdown will end on the 2nd of December, at which point it's another chaotic last-minute decision, is it?
Well, I can't see him giving an open-ended check to the devolved administrations. So I think it will be linked to the amount of time furlough is extended in England. So if that happens to go to 2 months, I can't see. I mean, this is borrowed money. So if he doesn't give it to the devolved nations, does that mean we don't pay interest on this borrowed money? So if this costs £14 billion to run in England, does that mean Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland don't have to pay a share of that £14 billion interest?
Oh, well. There's another issue that Douglas Ross brings up. Apparently, he's expecting a huge row from retail in England, retail businesses, because the retail shops have already stocked up with their stock for Christmas, expecting to sell it in December. If this lockdown stays in up to Christmas, even just another 2 weeks in December, they're going to lose an awful lot of money. And the people at Amazon are going to do really well.
Yeah. So what I suggest to the shops is they get themselves on Amazon.
Of course, you can do that. I've forgotten
exactly.
about that.
eBay and Amazon. That's I think. Well, I mean, I have the advantage of already knowing both the platforms, but I would certainly have moved all my stuff onto eBay and Amazon. And I'd have walked away from any landlord that hadn't given me consideration, shall we say, on the rent at this time.
But then, of course, the landlords are under pressure because they've borrowed to buy the lease that you are paying.
No, the landlords have got the option of a mortgage holiday.
Who pays the landlords for that?
Well, they can just not pay. They can add that 6 months on. So, I mean, the Tories, I'd love to know how many Tories are actually landlords as well. But the Tories hate the idea of rents being messed with. Unearned income is their lifeblood.
I was thinking more of the retail outlets, the landlords of all the shops and the stores and the offices.
Well, don't think about them. Think about the pension funds.
Oh, yes, and I understand there's a lot of American money, hedge funds and things invested in the property in the UK.
Well, think about the pension funds, because a lot of the money that goes into pension funds comes from commercial rented property. So that will affect ordinary people. So while we're all screaming at these horrible landlords that aren't giving you rent-free periods, remember your pension could be affected by all this.
Not if you're a civil servant, apparently.
Well, so I think there's a lot of questions here to be answered. I particularly like the idea that the Scottish government can turn around and say, no, I'm sorry, we don't owe you any money for the interest on these furlough loans because you didn't give it to us. You only gave it to England.
So we await at the moment developments, and the First Minister made it clear she needs answers over the next couple of days.
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is this has to factor into decisions about taking the lockdown that we have at the moment. I don't think there's nobody in level 4 at the moment. So she has to be saying, right, if we want to protect businesses by using the furlough scheme, we have to up the number of people in serious lockdown. Do we do it now before Christmas?
Yeah.
Or do we wait and see if our new levels system has worked?
She went into quite a lot of detail today, and we learned quite a lot of the way they think it through. The question of the clinical advice they get, and then they start weighing up the 4 harms that they balance that with. And there was even one pointed question about Lanarkshire, because Lanarkshire was if there was one part of Scotland that would be first into level 4, which would be the equivalent of a lockdown, it would be Lanarkshire, apparently.
Well, I think there's a possibility that if Sunak doesn't come back with an open-ended offer, that Scotland, the First Minister, Scotland, the Scottish Government, will turn around and say, right, I'm sorry, folks. We can't take the chance that we will need to have full lockdown before Christmas and not have the furlough scheme in place. So we're going to lock down totally the whole of Scotland for the
and blame you lot in London.
The same time as England, because the Westminster government has given us no choice.
Yeah, so that'll go down well with Douglas Ross. He won't like that at all.
Well, but Douglas Ross can say, well, don't blame the Scottish Tories. We asked for a flexible furlough scheme. Blame the English Tories who you can't vote for.
Look at the broad shoulders of this union.
Aye, well, only broad on a Wednesday when England needs them to be broad. The rest of the week, everybody else can go and stuff themselves.
Apparently, Douglas Ross has also criticised the way that the Tory government has handled Brexit. In other words, they completely ignored the fact that Northern Ireland and Scotland voted to stay. Scotland voted to stay in the EU 2-1.
Douglas Ross, the way he's going, as I think I said yesterday, he needs to team up with Murdo Fraser, because he's turning the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party into a different party to the one that's in power in England.
Well, that was Murdo Fraser's pitch when he came up against Ruth Davidson years ago now, as potential leader. And apparently it didn't go down very well in London.
No. But, well, I mean, I don't believe a word Douglas Ross says. I think this is just electioneering. I think this is for Trump. I think he will say anything that will get him votes.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're quite right there.
To the extent I fully expect him to come out in favour of universal, oh God, I've forgotten what you call it.
Universal basic income.
Universal basic income sometime soon.
I suppose that's another. Yes, he's certainly got an eye for any populist policy.
Well, you can afford to say anything you want when you're not going to be in power.
True. Apparently, he's also backing the extension of the £20 a week uplift on universal credit, and of course, supporting free school meals. Sorry, it's not funny.
No,
you need a free.
I fully expect him basically to run an SNP stroke. No, any good idea that anybody comes up with in the Scottish Parliament, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the SNP, Labour Party, he will take it on board. He's going full Trump here. The truth is an irrelevance to him.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you have that advantage if you're not going to be in power.
Well, what needs to be done is at Holyrood, we need to take full advantage of this road to Damascus conversion and start throwing some serious white papers about to see if the Tories actually will support it. We definitely need a free school meals paper slapped on the table soon to give the Tories an opportunity to back their new leader.
Yep.
What was the other thing we were going to talk about? Stuart Cosgrove.
Stuart Cosgrove. He's had a very interesting article in yesterday's Sunday National, longer than usual. It's normally quite a small one. Stuart Cosgrove, if you don't know who he is, let me enlighten you. Stuart Cosgrove is a senior journalist in Scotland. He used to be commissioning editor for Channel 4 for Scotland for 20 years or something. So he obviously had a lot of sway, shall we say, on people who wanted to get their programs on television. He's also, with him, Stuart Cosgrove and Tam Cowan have a weekend football show. It's about football, but the key thing about the show is it's called Off the Ball, is it's completely irreverent, and they get away with saying things that nobody else does on BBC anywhere in the UK, let alone in Scotland. He has taken his fellow journalists to task in this article. In particular, he narrows in on something that happened, an incident that happened last week in one of the press briefings, where was it somebody called Peter Smith, a journalist for ITN, so that'll be London rather than Scotland. He accidentally didn't mute himself when he finished asking his question of the First Minister, and we could hear a colleague of his, saying to him, "Oh, you took a swipe at her there then." So basically what we heard was convincing arguments that the journalists that we hear week in, week out, day in, day out on these press briefings are just looking to trip up the First Minister. They're not doing their job of holding the power to account, and especially during a pandemic, they're not informing the public more.
I think that the journalists at the press conferences have a great opportunity to delve into how the decisions are made at government level, and some of them take that opportunity. But more often than not, the information we're given is coming unprompted from Sturgeon and the various, what will we call them? Supporting guests.
Yes, supporting team.
She brings on. Although today was a good example, I think. Glenn Campbell asked good questions today.
Yes, he was. I thought
so. It's not every day. Well, it usually is every day, to be honest. I call them tabloid questions.
I call them hacks.
Well, they're questions that are asked to create headlines that are already in the heads of some of these journalists.
They've already written the headlines. They just need to put the words into the First Minister's mouth.
Yeah, and that's a problem with, I would say, every day, almost 50% of the questions asked.
But what is really revealing is that we have been privy for the first time to watch these journalists at work for 6 months now. The public has at last have seen how dirty and nasty this bunch is.
I wouldn't go too far. I mean, I think we have to be aware of our own biases here.
No, but if Stuart Cosgrove holds them to account.
Yeah, but Stuart...
And Stuart Cosgrove is very measured with everything he writes.
Yeah, but he's also an independent supporter. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong if Nicola Sturgeon makes a mistake, which she very rarely does. It must be very frustrating for people who are looking to write anti-SNP stuff. She's very good under pressure. if she makes a mistake, they've got every right to report that. But it's this continual twisting and turning, looking so microscopically at everything in order to make something into a mistake.
What's the difference between a cafe and a bistro? Okay.
Yeah.
Is that important? And what's the difference?
It is if you run a cafe or a bistro.
Yeah, but it's important in the grand scheme of things. And, you know, they go down a street and they ask one side of the streets in East Renfrewshire and the other side of the streets in Glasgow. And they moan, they interview a couple of people who are moaning because they can't have the same freedoms as their neighbours. Again, is it important? No.
It's nitpicking. But this links for me to something Mark Drakeford first brought up. That the function of these rules is not for you to go out and find a way to circumvent them.
No.
You should not be looking for a way around them or a way to push them out of shape. You should be obeying them for the good of the community. And you know, that is what a lot of these questions allow to be thought.
Well, as I say,
are you a cafe or a bar?
I return to my position. They have been exposed. That's the word I should have used rather than revealed. They have been exposed, these journalists, for the hacks that a lot of them are. I mean, and even when they go out with a camera to do vox pops, it's like they know exactly what they're going to put on television. So they ask a few people that are going past them, and then they film the people that will give them the answer they want.
We have the advantage of knowing, having done vox pops in the past, that
it's so easy to find somebody to speak. Oh yes, I'd love to speak on telly. What do you want me to say?
Well, I often notice that the BBC question isn't included. Whatever the question was isn't included quite often. So what you'll get is
what do you mean on the news?
Well, you'll get the question to the first vox poppy, and then it won't be asked of the second, third, fourth. And I often wonder whether the question was couched in quite the same way. But you and I know, I mean, you could do 50 vox pops. 5 of them might be useful to you in your article that you'd written previously, you know, your piece that you're going to do to camera. So obviously you use the 5 that suit your message.
Just one last, I think, on this topic of the hacks. We've got the Sun. I was expecting the Sun to pop up with a stupid question today, and he did. And his question was about because of this lockdown in England, would we be moving away from our system of levels in Scotland? And she answered that part of the question. And then she answered both parts. He had 2 parts to his question, and the First Minister answered both parts. And then she went to move on to the Simon Johnson of the Telegraph. And Chris mustn't interrupted her. Oh, I wanted to know the answer to the first question. And she was very annoyed. I answered that already, you idiot. She didn't actually say you idiot, but you know, fine with the tone of the voice.
I take it the answer was no, but we may have to reconsider that if Rishi Sunak doesn't want the purse strings.
She'd already answered this stupid question. He hadn't been listening. What a fool. I laughed.
Well, I mean, that can be construed that if the Treasury doesn't agree to a flexible furlough for the devolved administrations, that can be construed, and I don't think you could blame anybody for thinking they want the devolved administrations to follow what Westminster does. Westminster must be crapping themselves that the devolved administrations are getting it right and they're getting it wrong.
Well, you can't say they're getting it right in Northern Ireland at the moment. They're really struggling.
No, you can't. No, that's true. But Westminster must be shitting bricks.
I think it was interesting. There was 1 or 2 things the First Minister said. She referenced Wales, the problems they would have with the border, bearing in mind that there wasn't a big stress on, well, what's going to happen? You know, you expect this from the guy from Border TV. Well, what's going to happen in Carlisle and what's going to happen in Lanarkshire if it's higher, lower, worse, better? That was the only person. but she did reference it, that they were going to have a tough decision to make in Wales, because their 2-week lockdown ends this coming weekend. Hospitality in Wales will reopen. Hospitality just across the border in England will be closed. Will there be a huge rush of people across the border and coaches to go boozing in Wales?
Why didn't the border guy ask how she was going to force England to open the border between England and Scotland now that England were in lockdown? Or is it only when she shuts the border that it's an issue?
Yes. Simple answer. It's only political when she says it.
Yeah,
said something
exactly.
like that.
How dare England cut itself off from Scotland?
Yeah.
Should be the question they're asking. In outrage. What are you going to do? How are you going to force Boris to open the border and save the Union now that he's shut the border between Scotland and England?
Apparently they did. That was another thing. I mean, it was very informative, Presser. She mentioned that they had a COBRA meeting this morning. And one of the things they had agreed on was that they would, the travel restrictions would be harmonized across what would they had come up with? Intra-travel was the expression. UK intra-travel. I thought that was quite an interesting word.
Well, I mean, I do think that's only sensible, especially for deliveries. I think as individuals, we all know we're not allowed to go anywhere.
Well, that shoots that completely kills the idea that the political questions about the border are dead in the water now at the moment.
Well, it's only a political question if Scotland says English people can't come here, or people living in England.
But she has said that Scottish people can't go to England.
Yeah,
be told. You can't go. You can't even go across. I can't even go to Fife. Come on.
Well, that's hardly a hardship.
Be careful. We may have fans in Fife.
Not anymore. I'm looking forward to the Leith lockdown. We don't have to go to Edinburgh.
Okay. Where does that start? Bellevue, Edinburgh.
Yeah, McDonald Road will do for me. Actually, no, Elm Row, because I quite like going up to the wee veg shop just at Elm Row.
Tatty Shaw's.
Tatty Shaw's, in fact.
There was one other issue that exercised you, and I had a look at it when you pointed it up, which was the Electoral Commission. We know that the Tory government have attacked the Electoral Commission. They've attacked the civil service. They attacked the devolved nations. They've attacked the courts. They've attacked everybody's at fault apart from them. But what I noticed about this article was the glaring thing that's missing is the way money is spent outside. You know, they authorize groups. Say for the referendum, certain groups were authorized to take part in the referendum, and certain groups weren't. Why do you need to be authorized? You'd be better off not being authorized, and then you can spend as much money as you like.
No, you can't.
You can if you're a foreign company.
Well, no, it's not as simple as that. There are
What do you
rules.
mean it's not as simple as that? If
it's not as simple as that. You can't simply start a group,
you don't need
not
to start
apply
a group
to be an official group, and spend as much money as you want.
If you're the Koch brothers, you can spend as much money as you like from America, and nobody can stop you.
If you do it in America, if you do it online, for instance, you're probably right. If they were to do it with Facebook ads.
Well, that's the way that apparently the Russians got Trump elected, isn't it?
Well, that you're probably right about that. But the problem with the Electoral Commission, it doesn't have enough big enough teeth.
Exactly. There's no teeth.
It needs. I didn't realize the suggestion was that it was 4% of income was the biggest fine, or £500,000, whichever is larger. I don't think that's enough.
Of course it's not enough. If you've got we know that there was a £10 million budget by one group. That's nothing in terms of the worldwide money. If you're worth 25 billion, What's £10 million to you?
Well, I think it should be 20% of your income. And that's simple. I don't think they should put a hard figure on it.
It'd be 20% of the spend.
Yeah. And until you pay it, you should go to jail.
And then they could still just figure that out as a tax.
Well, you should go to jail, and all your successful candidates should be thrown in the water with weights around their ankles.
Tower of London, I think, for them.
Well, there should be serious penalties. But the big problem is, of course, the committee that was once, it had to be balanced.
Used to be cross-party, apparently, but
Yeah,
we've discovered it's not
no
now.
one party had what's the word? Had more than any other, could outvote the rest of the committee. Now the Tories have a majority on the committee.
Yeah. It's called the Speaker's Committee, which regulates the Electoral Commission, and it's got no balls.
Well, it's apparently it is criticising the Electoral Commission in terms of it having too much power, and everybody else is criticising it because it doesn't have enough power.
Well, I am angry because Darren Hughes, who wrote this article, has completely omitted all this, the danger of all this foreign money. Never mentioned it in this article.
Did he not mention dark money?
Never mentioned it in this article.
And obviously the Tory party, who are bankrolled by...
Who bankrolled? We don't know.
That's about why I went quiet when I said by. The Tory
Okay.
party, who are bankrolled by...
Ooh.
Who knows, are not happy about more scrutiny.
Well, I gather that we should say goodbye to Brian Taylor.
Oh yeah, Brian's away. Yeah.
I listened to
all the good ones are going.
The BBC podcast, and he was on the BBC Scotland podcast. Philip Sim and Lindsay Bewes, regular Holyrood.
Oh, the it was politics.
Podlitical, I think it's called.
Podlitical is exactly what it's called.
And I listened to that this morning, and Brian Taylor was on that. We didn't get any huge reveal, but he did finish off with his catchphrase.
Toodaloo the new.
Oh, are we away?
Well, I'm sad to see him go. I always thought he was. I remember him very nearly being in tears at the Salmon press conference when Salmon resigned, because they're old buddies. Apparently, they went to university together.
I know he's got a soft spot for independence. He kind of hinted it in the pod that I listened to. Interesting times, he said.
Okay, I think that'll do us for today, Stuart. Yeah.
I think we're going to have a lot of interesting things to come up this week.
Yeah, I think this week could be interesting. I do expect a Machiavellian move that will bolster Douglas Ross's position. I have to say, I think this is set up for him.
I'm not sure what's going to happen with the furlough. Will we get flexible furlough for Scotland and the other devolved nations or not?
I think we will, but I don't think it'll be open-ended.
Who's going to win the American election, Norrie?
I think Pence will win it.
Not Pence, Biden.
Oh, sorry, Biden.
I think Pence was the...
Pence is the vice president.
Vice president.
Yeah, I think Biden will win it.
The money's on there not being a decision. Remember hanging Chads a few years ago? This thing's going to go on.
Well, across just about every way of looking at it, Biden's ahead. That wasn't the case with Clinton. It'll be interesting. But with it being the electoral college system, you know, it just makes it really hard.
Who knows? And we won't necessarily know on Wednesday.
No, I don't think we will if it looks like Trump's losing.
And he'll refuse to accept the decision, by all accounts.
I think what he might do is insist on not going to jail to give up the White House. I could see that.
Yeah, possibly, yes.
Okay, let's call it a day at that. Thanks for being with me, Stuart.
It's always a pleasure, Norrie.
I'm Norrie Stewart, and thanks for listening and watching, folks. And we'll catch up with you tomorrow, which I think might be a bit more Star Spangled Banner than today, seeing as it's the election. I see a very Star Spangly background in the future.
For a couple of days, anyway.
All right, okay. Thanks for listening again, folks, and we'll catch you tomorrow. Cheers for now.